Hello, my name's Jenny Nex and I'm curator of the musical instrument collection at the University of Edinburgh. I'm delighted to welcome you here to St Cecilia's Hall, where we have about 500 items from the collection on display. And today we're going to think about the history of the piano. Like most musical instruments, the piano didn't appear from nowhere. There were already wonderful stringed keyboard instruments being made, such as this harpsichord, which was made in Florence in around about 1620. Now, the action of a harpsichord is a plucking mechanism, and you can play wonderfully expressively on the instrument, but you can't do much by means of your touch. And the instrument technician who was employed by the Medici family in Florence to look after their instruments and to come up with new ideas, Bartolomeo Cristofori, came up with the idea of hitting the strings instead, because then the speed of the hammer determines how loud the note is. Cristofori's instrument was originally called the gravicembalo che fa il piano e forte, meaning a big harpsichord that does quiets and louds. Thankfully, we've abbreviated it, so now we just call it the piano, which is ironic given that the instrument is now much louder than it was then, and of course piano means quiet. It was a delicate sounding instrument. The hammers were basically a lollipop stick with a roll of cardboard on them, so they were very light. It was not a loud instrument. It was quieter than the harpsichord, but it had this feature that you could vary the dynamic just with your touch, and the Medicis were very happy with that. Cristofori only had to please the Medicis. He wasn't interested in a big marketing campaign, so the piano didn't take off as a popular instrument at all at that point. It took about 50 years from the original invention, around about 1700, until the piano became more popular. People had got the idea of it, other people had seen them and brought the idea northwards through Germany and up into France and Britain. And around about 1760, we see the piano becoming a popular instrument amongst fashionable musicians in London. Having shown you the harpsichord, which is similar to the very first sort of pianos, I'd like now to take you to see a square piano made in London in the 1760s, which is the kind of instrument that really made the piano popular in Britain. This little instrument here is the kind of piano that really made the piano take off in Britain. It was made in the 1760s by Johannes Zumper, or Zumpi as some people call him, who was one of a number of makers who came over from Germany and the Low Countries and set up shop in London. We call it a square piano. The Germans have a much more sensible name for it. They call it the Tafelklavier, or table piano, and when you put the lid down, it makes a very good table. They are very delicate instruments. They don't have a strong sound. The soundboard is very small, the resonating box under it is very small, and the hammers are very delicate, so it's not a loud instrument. It's very much for domestic use. But it became popular because it became fashionable. Zumper had a relationship with J.C. Bach, the composer, and Bach was the music master to the royal family. And of course, if they had something, then everybody wanted one. So suddenly the piano was the desirable instrument, and having one of these little instruments in your house was a sign of status. You might be able to notice that it doesn't have any pedals. We're very used these days to using the right pedal for the dampers and the left pedal as a quiet effect, but these instruments didn't have pedals at all. But they do have a way that you can control the dampers. There are two little hand stops inside of the end of the case here, much like the hand stops that you find on harpsichords. And one of them raises the dampers for the upper half of the keyboard and the other for the lower half of the keyboard. So you can't use them individually, or you probably wouldn't use them for individual notes because you'd be doing too much of that while you were trying to play at the same time. So it does change the way we think about this particular feature that we're so used to today. So the square piano remained a very popular instrument, and the design was gradually enlarged. This is an instrument made in about 1805, and it was actually made in Edinburgh. This is by Andrew Rockhead. So we can see that the fashions that were set up in London travelled throughout the whole of Britain. Now, some of the things that makers were looking at and thinking about was the layout of the instrument as a whole. The little Zumper instrument has the tuning pins at the end of the case over here, but here in this particular one, they've been moved position along the back of the case. And this wasn't the only idea. Other people suggested having them at the front here. So it's the kind of practicalities of how you tune the instrument, how easy it is to reach the tuning pins for the tuner, the technician. Another thing we can see here is the extension of the compass. So we've got more notes at the top here. And they've actually made it so that the soundboard is longer and extends over the keyboard. So the top notes, the hammers actually have to pop out through a little slot at the back here to hit the strings. So it's all to do with making a bit more noise, a bit more volume, but these still are very much domestic instruments and ideal for an Edinburgh tenement flat, for example. So this instrument does have a pedal now for controlling the dampers, much like we're used to on a modern piano, and the instrument sounds a little like this. Another important type of piano is the upright. There are many different kinds because a lot of makers tried to come up with their unique selling point, if you like, that would enable them to promote their particular type of piano. This example here by John Stewart is what he called a euphonicon, but it's basically a piano. But as you can hopefully see, it's not got a big case around the whole of the strings and the frame. We've got a big metal frame with the strings which are very visible, so it looks very different. But the action inside is pretty much the same as you would have found in other upright pianos from the 1840s. The other thing that's different is this doesn't have a sound board like most other pianos, but instead it has resonating boxes positioned along the back here. So there's a smallish one at the top end, a medium-sized one in the middle, and a larger one at the bottom. So you can imagine they're like a violin body, a viola body, and a cello body that will respond and resonate at different frequencies. I like the look of this piano. I don't know whether it would fit in to your decor at home. I think it would fit in for quite a few people's, but it's quite an awkward instrument. It's quite top heavy and the movers find this instrument quite hard to deal with. So maybe that's the reason this design didn't last for a particularly long time. Another type of upright piano that's a lot more common is like these little cottage instruments, this particular example being made by Broadwoods. Now, I have to mention that Broadwood was actually Scottish, although he's often called an English piano maker. And he did work in London, so that's why we think of them as English pianos. But he actually grew up in the Borders, where he probably learned to use woodworking skills with his father. This instrument is lovely. It's got the fretwork panels on the front here, and behind the fretwork we have some silk. And these were actually specialist occupations at this time. We know from a description that George Dodd wrote in his Days at the Factories in 1843 that there was a big quad with buildings all around the sides and that the different activities were divided up between different workshops. And we can see the different parts of the instrument very clearly. There were men that specialised in making the fretwork panels on the front here. We know that there were women involved in the silking of pianos. So it's nice to be able to see the role that women played in instrument making because they're often very hard to find. There were also specialist keyboard makers. The case makers were another specific trade. And then the men who made the soundboards were called the belly men, which is one of my favourite names for an occupation. And we can see that it's a beautiful little instrument. And these instruments were still high-end, but they were for domestic use. Again, very lovely little pianos, much as one would love to have at home these days as well. I'd now like to show you another piano from the Broadwood firm, but this is a grand piano made a little bit earlier, so in 1793. This piano is absolutely typical of the grand instruments that were coming out of London in the 1790s. Often we hear about instrument makers and their way of working, and we think of it as a kind of craft skill where they do things by trial and error, or they've learnt from their master, which is true in a lot of cases. But in the case of Broadwoods, we know that they also went to see some scientists to help work out the optimum way of laying out the inside of the instrument and also of how the action is working. What they wanted to do is to work out how to minimise the join between where the iron strings change over to brass strings in the bass. They do this because of the different tensile strength of the different metals. It means you can have shorter strings that sound good in the bass. If you just carried on with iron strings all the way down, the strings would have to be very long, which makes the instrument a bit impractical. So by having brass strings, you can shorten them a bit. But then they wanted to make it so that the transition point wasn't audible. So they worked out how to do this mathematically, and they worked out that they wanted to have the bridge in two sections and to have the transition between the two types of stringing material on the two different bridges. Another thing they wanted to do was to optimize the way that the instrument sounds in tune. Any string is vibrating in a very complicated way. It's not just doing one vibration, it's doing lots of things at the same time. And ideally, these different vibrations would form a harmonic series, because that's what our ears like. That's how our ears hear a pitch. But unfortunately, strings are not ideal. So they all have a bit of what we call inharmonicity built into them. So this was Broadwood consulting with Edward Whittaker Gray and Tiberius Cavallo. They worked out the ideal point along the string to hit the string so that the in-tune parts of the sound were made louder and the bits of the sound that didn't really fit with the harmonic series were reduced. So although they did a lot by trial and error, and of course they did a lot by instinct because they were highly skilled and they'd grown up in workshops, they also did the math in this particular type of instrument. Grand pianos, of course, are much bigger than square pianos. We have a much bigger soundboard and the cavity underneath is bigger, so it's a bigger, more resonant sound. So it's still not as big as a modern grand piano. It's still entirely wooden. There's no metal framing in here. We've got two pedals now on this instrument. They're attached to the legs of the stand, so you have to have your feet a bit far apart. But if you were a young lady, you would have been wearing a big dress, so it didn't really matter. The right pedal is the dampers, as we would expect, and the left is an una corda. And that's literally in Italian one string, and that's because instead of hitting the three strings that each note has, the entire mechanism shifts sideways so that it only hits one string, and the keyboard moves as well. So here's without, and then with the una corda. When Broadwood was making pianos like the one I've just showed you in London, other makers were making instruments much more like this one in Vienna. The Viennese style and the British style of piano making were very different. The way the mechanism is laid out inside is completely the other way round, and you get a very different feel and a very different sound. A lot of people love the Viennese instruments. Of course, they're lovely for Mozart, early Beethoven, Schubert. It's lovely to sing with instruments like this because you don't have to belt out your leader too hard. You can enjoy the nuances of the instrument. And this instrument I love because it's got different voices inside. Lots of makers made pianos in the early end of things that had different sounds, like you can get on a harpsichord. And that's something we've kind of lost since about the 1870s, when everything became a bit uniform. But this instrument has its normal sound. It's got a quiet effect, which is different from the una corda. It's called a moderator, and it brings a little piece of felt between the hammer and the strings, which I think is very beautiful. And it's also got a bassoon stop, which brings a roll of parchment against the string, and you get a buzzy sound for the bottom half of the compass. I mean, who wouldn't want one of those on their piano? So it does give you these different timbres, these different qualities of sound that we don't have on pianos today in the same way. I'm just going to demonstrate a little more of the sound. I just think that's such a magical, quiet tone quality that we could easily build into modern pianos, but we don't. Now, you might be noticing there's no pedals. I'm not doing anything with my feet. I've not got hand stops except for the bassoon, so how am I doing that? In this instrument, the dampers and the moderator are controlled by knee levers. So my right knee can raise and lower the dampers, and my left knee controls the moderator. And it really tells us, I think, something about the people who were making these instruments and the customers. They liked having different things available to them, like we do now on the synthesizer, where we press different buttons. And we find instruments with percussion built in as well, drums and triangles and cymbals and things like that, and these different timbral stops. And I think that's what I really love about early pianos. They have so much to offer and so much to tell us about the music. If you'd like to come here and see the instruments for yourself, the museum is open from Tuesday to Saturday from 10 o'clock until 5 o'clock, and we'd be delighted to welcome you here.